Hey everybody, welcome to the Flatirons Tuning Question of the Week. This week our question comes from Keith at 969 Performance, who wants to know, when should you upgrade to an aftermarket oil cooler?
Before we talk about an aftermarket oil cooler, it's worth mentioning that many Subarus, like all STIs and some WRXs, came with an oil cooler from the factory. Subaru calls it an oil cooler, but I'll say it's an oil cooler because it uses coolant to cool the oil instead of air. I think probably a more accurate term would be a heat exchanger for the oil, and that's what's on the table here in front of me. It sits between the oil filter and the block, and it basically runs the oil through this to kind of maintain the temperature right as it's going into the engine. So all of the STIs have had this since 2004, and probably a lot of the JDM since before that, but the WRX only got it from 2002 to 2007. It's definitely better to have this than not, but again, because it's using coolant, it's not, the purpose of this is not to keep the oil at a minimum temperature. It actually has two purposes. In a cold environment or when it's cold out, because coolant warms up faster than oil does, the idea is that the coolant will actually warm the oil up to operating temperature faster, but then in hot climates or if you're on track, the coolant does serve the purpose of stabilizing the oil temperatures. And like for instance, our 14 WRX, it didn't have one of these. We ran it for a couple years without anything like this, and we definitely saw that on track under hard driving, the oil temperatures were getting really hot because there was nothing there to really check that temperature. Kind of got a little bit scary, and so we put something on there. So it's definitely better to have the factory one than not to. But for a lot of aggressive track driving, if it is a purpose-built track car and or you really want to maintain a very controlled and low oil temperature, then an external cooler is probably going to be better at that for track use, for hard use, than the factory heat exchanger.
So what's the main difference between the factory heat exchanger and an aftermarket oil cooler?
I mean, the biggest difference is obviously that you're using cooler outside air to cool the oil off versus coolant, which is going to be fairly hot. Most of the time, especially on a street car, you would want a thermostatic plate to send the oil out to the cooler. So you're only going to be sending the oil around the cooler if it's up at operating temperature. So you're going to, your thermostat's going to open probably at something around 190, 200 degrees, something like that, to maintain that normal operating temperature of oil, and not run the oil through the cooler before then. The factory oil cooler, because it's running coolant through there, it's not going to keep the oil temperature nearly as low as something like an aftermarket cooler could, but it really does stabilize the temperature. The advantage of the factory heat exchanger is it's much simpler. It's much smaller. There's no packaging. I mean, it's just this little column that sits above the oil cooler. So it's very reliable long term, and it's very simple. Versus a lot of these aftermarket ones, you're going to have this thermostatic plate with the lines that go out to the cooler. You're going to have to run the lines to the cooler, find a place to put the cooler, run the oil back, make sure that the lines and fittings are tight, that they're not leaking, that you're not having any issues with the header, which we may have done once or twice ourselves. So there's a little bit of extra complexity with the aftermarket ones. So that's the biggest one. They're a little bit more effective, but they're more complex. The factory ones maybe not quite as effective, especially in very hard driving or high power applications, but a lot simpler.
With an aftermarket oil cooler, is there a chance of losing oil pressure?
There shouldn't be, but we've actually seen some examples in the last year or two where yes, it's happened with certain designs. So that's definitely something to be aware of. I would say if there was only one gauge, if you could only put one gauge on your car and one gauge only, you'd want it to be an oil pressure gauge. If you could put two gauges, it would be oil pressure and oil temperature. Especially if you're going to be tracking your Subaru, having a good idea of what your oil pressure and oil temperatures are, especially on track, is really important, really helpful. So if you're going to put on an external aftermarket oil cooler, either make sure that you're using a very well-designed and well-vetted one, and or keep a good eye on your oil pressures. Ideally, there should be a minimal pressure change from before you put on the oil cooler to after. If there's too big of a change, if once you put on the oil cooler you're seeing more of a pressure drop than what you would want, that would be a time to really look at your setup, look at the kit that you're using, see if the fitting sizes are too small, something like that, and make sure that you can make whatever adjustments you need to make to get your oil pressure back to where you want it to be.
So is there a temperature threshold where you would want to move from the factory one to an aftermarket?
Ideally, you wouldn't want your oil temps to go over about 230 degrees, 240 maybe. And it is worth mentioning, modern direct injected cars tend to run much hotter oil temperatures. And I'm not sure about all the details as far as why. So if it's a direct injected car, you may see hotter oil temperatures than that. But you still want to keep them under control, keep them in check. If you're always getting up to that threshold, like 230, 240 every time you're tracking the car, and you'd like to get it something more like 200, 210, that's where you would go to an external oil cooler. If you see any kind of temperature spikes, like if you do like 5 hot laps and on your 4th or 5th lap you're seeing a big temperature spike in the oil temps, there again, maybe you're starting to get to the limit of the factory cooling system for the oil and for the coolant, and so that's where something like an external oil cooler would maybe give you a little bit of additional cooling, keep the oil more cool than what the factory system could.
Thanks everybody for checking out the question of the week. Remember, we do these every week, and you can submit your questions in the comments below or through our messages on Instagram.
Yeah, thanks very much for watching. Really appreciate your support. And as always, until next time, stay tuned.